now before I forget.
That was crazy about the University of Chicago Zoom getting hacked.
Yeah, that happened a lot at the beginning of the pandemic when people first started. It happened on tends to happen on talks where you spread the Zoom invite broadly, and it was weird. People were RSVPing to this talk that should not have gotten the invitation. And I was like, what the heck? I'm gonna admit people individually.
I'm flattered they're interested.
Well,
Hi, Jim. Welcome. We're gonna have Arshia go first and then Amanda, and you'll go last.
sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Maybe we'll just give people one more minute.
You know, Melanie, we never made a plan for like introducing all three of our panelists. So maybe they could introduce themselves at the beginning, just briefly.
Yeah, I thought, well, it's 3:02. I will keep an eye in the corner here so that I can admit anyone who shows up late. Oh, here we go. But I thought that I would do a little tiny brief introduction and then let Arshia go first. So, the purpose of today's meeting is to have have people from different institutions across Chicagoland talk about how you transition from going from a pilot study to the next grant, whatever that is, K or something else. And so we have people at different stages in their career. Amanda is going to speak, and Amanda from Matthew from Rush, Arshia Baig from University of Chicago, and Jim Lash from UIC. And they're all at different stages of their career. And obviously they're all at different institutions as well, because each institution has access to different resources that we would want our trainees and awardees to know about. So, all right, and I'll let each of them introduce themselves and give a little background and talk about their history and share what they have to say. Okay, Arshia, you take it away.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Arshia Baig. Good to meet everyone here. Thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me, actually. So I am a general internist. So I'm a primary care doc. And so I have an MD and an MPH. And I'm just stating that in case other folks have dual degrees. So I'm a clinician. I see patients in the primary care group here as an outpatient and as well as around at the inpatient side of the hospital. I'm a health services researcher and interested in really improving diabetes outcomes with the focus on Latinx populations. And I use partnered research approaches like CBPR and implementation science. I also have a role at the medical school. I co-run Scholarship and Discovery for Pittsburgh School of Medicine, which is the research infrastructure, the research program for all the medical students here. And I also have some administrative roles. I co-run the pilot grants program and investigative development core for the C3EN Center. So is that a good enough introduction, Melanie? Okay, great. I think you're on mute, Melanie.
Why don't you just go ahead and jump into your whole thing, and then we'll have Amanda introduce herself before she starts.
Oh, I see. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think I have about 10 minutes or so. So I guess we're talking about how to be successful as an early stage investigator and what you need to do, or what I guess I can talk about what I've done, and then to kind of get on to get your next big grant, and move on from being, let's say, an early stage investigator, clinical instructor, assistant professor to associate. So when I came to the University of Chicago many years ago, I had an idea of what I wanted to study. I think I knew I wanted to have a focus on Latinx populations, but I really had to carve out, I think, my interest in terms of like how it complements what else was going on at the University of Chicago. And I think that was actually really important. Initially, I found actually that not many people were working on Latinx populations here. And so I was like, okay, that's something I'm interested in, something I've done. I had done that in fellowship, although I had worked with like many immigrant populations. And so I realized that that was something that I was very interested in. And then, I think I started to note that there's lots of diabetes research being here down at the University of Chicago. And that really is, within what I treat clinically, I was very interested in that. Granted, in fellowship, I was mostly working on hypertension, but, oftentimes hypertension and diabetes we see are comorbid. And so, or common comorbidities. So, I remember when I first started here that my section chief was like, okay, like I think I started in September. She's like, well, there's an October pilot grant deadline. I was like, oh, wait a minute. Like I wasn't sure I could, get an application together. And I actually forget, I think I maybe put something together, but I didn't get it because I just wasn't prepared. I just moved here. But then there was another diabetes pilot program with the deadline a little bit later. And as I started to figure out like what research I wanted to do, okay, like a diabetes focus, Mexican Americans, I started to meet with some community partners here in Chicago who are mostly working with majority Mexican American population here in Chicago. And with them, I started to formulate my research plan. I heard a lot about what was needed in the community and then also reflected upon what was actually in the literature because I knew a lot of folks that I was working with in the community, they wanted programming, but I knew that I needed to also do some research and actually add to the literature, right? So we can move the field forward in terms of improving diabetes outcomes among Mexican Americans. So, and, just the way that, CBPR is, it takes, some time to form collaborations and, work together on the research plan, the intervention. So then I was successful in getting a pilot grant to pilot my this church-based diabetes education program. And I had found in the literature there really wasn't much in terms of diabetes education for Latinx populations. So there was that interesting sort of focus on the literature and the research gaps, but then also working with community partners and designing something that was needed in the community. And then from there, I was able to use some of that pilot information. I actually did focus groups initially. That was what the pilot grant was for. And from that, I got some publications. And then actually I wrote it into my K23 award or grant application through NIDDK. And based on just the premise of the gap in the literature, the focus groups that I had done, the community advisory board that I had put together, and the fact that I had gotten some pilot funding, I was able to get a K23 award for 5 years on NIDDK to actually design the intervention and pilot it. And so that was successful. That was 5 years of work. But, alongside of that, what I did was actually working with the collaboration that University of Chicago already had with the Midwest Clinicians Network, which is a network of FQHCs, fairly qualified health centers across the Midwest, 10 states. And that was sort of kind of like my side project, working with them. I did a survey of their preparedness for taking care of Latinx populations, cultural competency, language services. And then we actually had an opportunity to do some funded work through our diabetes center and the Midwest Clinicians Network on diabetes group visits. So that was something that I sort of started just initially just really doing just focus groups and interviews, trying to understand, because we went to like a bunch of states. My project manager and I drove to a lot of places and talked to a lot of staff members. And then again, had that basis of like, well, what kind of interventions are health centers needing to improve their diabetes care? And so, as things went on, I kind of had these two projects that I was working in parallel. And, and I'm going to talk about my successes and my failures, like no path is just a straight path. And I, tried to get funding for a larger church-based intervention. And that was challenging, I think a lot of it was like, how can you do a cluster randomized design trial with like a limited number of churches? And if it's faith-based, like, are you excluding people? There's a lot of critiques that I was getting. I kept at it though. And then, but then with the group visit work, I was like, well, there is this call for 5-year projects with the Office of Minority Health through the Department of Health and Human Services. And they were looking for 5-year projects, so a federal 5-year grant, not an R01, but still a large grant, and to improve health disparities. And they were looking for across a region. And so I applied with the group visit work that we had done. We had actually done like a mini pilot to sort of see if it worked. And it did work in terms of improving A1Cs. So then I ended up getting a 5-year grant through that work, like through my side project. But that was, really great. It was my first large project. And then from there, I've actually been able to build a research career, let's say, in doing like health implementation, group visit projects. And now I have a large study through the C3EN Center, and then also working with health centers and looking at diabetes distress screening. So, I think for me, a lot of the formative work that I did in terms of focus groups and interviews allowed me to apply for the larger grants. And actually now we're looking to see how to expand the church-based work, maybe in addressing like mental health among Latinx population. So leveraging the churches and community organizations. So that's sort of the next idea that I have. So I hope that's a good summary of my trajectory so far. I'm happy to take questions maybe when we finish.
Oh, we're going to do a little mini discussion after each person, and then we'll do a bigger discussion at the end. I think, Archie, I want to hear about how you leveled up your skill set between the pilot and applying for your, would you say it was a K-23? And like, what resources did you take advantage of at U Chicago or in Chicagoland or even outside of that?
Yeah, so I've always been very interested in behavioral trials. So I did apply and got into an NIH behavioral trials institute. I don't know if they have it anymore, but it was like 2 weeks in Virginia in the summer. But it was like intensive every day, and learning about behavioral trials, all the way from the stats to power calculations to study design to smart designs, like all that stuff. So I did do that. Yes, that is it, the OBSSR training. And then what else did I do? So more recently, there was an NIDDK Implementation Science Institute. So I applied for that and I got into that. So I did that for, I think it was 2 years. That was all, they used to have an in-person component, but I think I was all virtual. So that was great. And actually that helped me write 2 of my R01s, because I sort of had a group of folks that I could, had a mentor assigned to me, and got a lot of input. And it was my first time writing implementation science grants. So it was really helpful. So those 2 institutes are really helpful. Locally, through the ITM, they have something called the R Studio. And that was really helpful as I was writing my first R01 to get feedback. You have to send your aims like so much in advance, and they pretty much, I think they comment on the aims. I forget if it was the whole research plan or not. And then it's like a mini study review committee, but you're there, like you're listening to them give critiques. So those are the resources that I remember using, or having access to.
Archie, what do you think made you a good candidate for the NIH training and the NIDDK training that you took? Like, was the application process for that hard, or?
After writing a K-23 award, I don't think any other grants are that hard. I feel like that was the hardest grant I've written. Maybe like writing a CTSA or Center grant is more challenging. I've never done that, so I can't speak to that. But no, I mean, I think from what I remember, I think you just had to have probably like a personal statement to talk about like why you're interested in this topic and what you're going to do with it, And then I think there was probably like a draft research plan or something, like what projects are you working on that this skill set would help you in. So I think I was kind of at a place where I had done a lot of research, a fair amount of research, but I wanted to like get the skills to move it almost in another direction, or add another component. So, and I think for the behavioral research one, that was much earlier in my career. I think I had my K-23 at that time. And so I think I was able to convince them that this is what I wanted to do. This is a part of like my career development. So I, probably the research experience that I had and how I was going to use those tools in the future. Those are probably important arguments to make for those institutes.
Archie,
Yeah.
Oh, do you see the question in the chat, Arshia?
Yeah, so in terms of preliminary data. Oh, yeah, no, I hear ya. So that's a great question. Gosh, well, I think normally when we talk about qualitative work, we're always thinking about you do enough interviews or focus groups until you're not hearing anything new, right? So I think for us, I mean, our first focus groups was probably, I don't know, probably 30 people or something like that. And I think the site visits, I forget how many, we did like 6 site visits and I don't know, probably 4 interviews at each site. So I don't think you have to do like, 50, 60, 100 interviews or focus groups, but probably enough until you get what we call like theme saturation, where you're not hearing as many, any new themes come up. So I don't know, I would say like around 30 people, like for focus groups or interviews, but that's just 30 interviews is a lot too, if you're doing, like very systematic qualitative analysis. But yeah, not like 100 people, let's say that. I don't know if that was the most useful answer. Other people should chime in, really.
Well, great. Thank you, Arshia. And if anyone has more questions for Arshia, they can ask them towards the end. And I think we'll move on to Amanda. Amanda, let me change the view so that Arshia is not spotlighted anymore.
Thank you. All right, so then I know you did your brief introduction, Melanie, but I'm Amanda Matthew. I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I'm an associate professor in family and preventive medicine at Rush. And I just put together a few slides to kind of organize what I might be able to contribute on this topic. So would you like to go to the next slide, please? Okay. Yeah, so in terms of my own funding track record, I think, there were kind of 2 points where I went from pilot data to kind of scaling up to a bigger award. And Melanie asked me to focus on the K application specifically. So that's kind of these first few rows. So I had an F32, which is a postdoctoral fellowship. I had, at the time I wrote my K, I was at Northwestern University at Feinberg School of Medicine on the research faculty there. So they had, I think, a similar mechanism to what's in place with the ITM, just in terms of, a small internal research voucher. So I took the data from each of those to be preliminary data in my K application. And then I kind of, did the same thing of taking data from my K pilot trial as preliminary data for the R01. So I'm focusing on the former. Yeah, go ahead, Melanie. So this is a screenshot right from my K23 application. And I should mention that, I mean, I had quite a few examples. I mean, I think maybe 6 to 10 to work with, which was really helpful to me. So if anyone would like to reach out individually, I'm more than happy to share my applications as well. And so for the K23, it was a treatment study. I think maybe kind of similar to yours, Arshia, where it was kind of a patient-oriented pilot RCT behavioral development approach. And so the pilot data I had was pretty thin. I mean, it was just a small lab study that was basically showing that the constructs that we wanted to target with the behavioral treatment were relevant to the population. So I just had, that one small figure to paste in. I described some of the work that I had done with my F32, which was also a human lab study, just to kind of show that I had some of the relationships already in place with my proposed mentorship team. And we were kind of trying to make the case of using behavioral social sciences basic research to inform a behavioral treatment strategy. So those, that was kind of how I used the pilot data I had, which was not a treatment study. It was a human lab study. To say, this is how we informed our conceptual model, and this is how we chose the constructs to target in the treatment study. And then some additional pearls that I've kind of gained when it comes to to grant writing, but specifically, preparing a K application. So this idea of the 4 components, this was something that Mercy Carnathon used to talk about at Northwestern. So I really got in my head about the idea of having to have a perfect research idea and just waiting for lightning to strike and having just, this perfect, inspired, brilliant idea. And I think that can be really, you can get stuck with that. So I loved the way that she framed it, that basically a research idea boils down to these 4 components where you choose a population, design or methodology, intervention or exposure, and outcome. And it's just about combining those components. So there has to be something that's unique about it. It should be a stretch for you in some way. And it should be something that, isn't already out there in your lit search. If all 4 of those components have already been combined by someone else, you haven't got a novel idea. But it just kind of helps you to, I think, kind of think about your research question and how to pivot a little bit based on what you've already done. So for me, I was already doing smoking research. And so the population was new for me. I was focusing on working with individuals with COPD. I found behavioral treatment design that I'm sure everyone's familiar with, the Orbit model, as kind of the methodology that was guiding the research steps. And then the intervention was also familiar to me, I guess, the intervention and the outcomes. As a clinical psychologist, I was pretty comfortable with the behavioral treatment approach we were pitching. So it was, some things that I had a track record for, some things that were a stretch that I then kind of incorporated into my training plan. But that's kind of how I got around that idea of feeling like I needed the very perfect research idea before I could move forward. The other guidance I've heard quite a bit is just making sure that the scope is reasonable, so that you're actually pitching something that's feasible to do. You shouldn't lay out maybe your full vision is the research program, but then the specific project is just a step in that direction toward an overall goal. Next slide. Okay, so I mentioned successful examples were helpful to me. I used a lot of institutional resources that I know are in place at Rush as well. Grant writing seminars, taking advantage of kind of the pre-submission grant review or the mock study section. Through the Rush Research Mentoring Program, they also pay for professional editing services, which was helpful to me just kind of as a last step before submitting to make things look really polished, and I think it improved the professionalism of it. So that I would certainly recommend as well. I did the same NIH Summer Institute and had that same experience, that it was really helpful. And I mean, the guidance I've heard before is to start writing early. So ideally 6 months out. I've heard kind of at minimum 4 months out, because that really allows you to give yourself enough distance from the application that you can try and see it from the reviewer's perspective instead of just being so enmeshed that you really can't see it. And it also gives you the opportunity to be able to really get meaningful feedback from other people and have time to incorporate it. So the advice that I've received is to wait until you've got a solid Ames solid Ames page before you even start on the approach or the other science sections, to try to have a working draft 2 months out so that you can do one of those pre-submission reviews. And really just to realize that you're not going to have fresh eyes anymore. So you're relying on other people to find those errors in your logic. I mean, ideally it should be some people who know the content area, some people who are completely new to it. You can solicit, even just a 15-minute read over the specific aims, because that's kind of naturalistic. I mean, that's what the reviewers will do, the ones who aren't assigned to your application. So something like that is valuable too, but really give yourself time to shop it around. Next slide. And then just some brief comments about that K to R transition. So these were some pearls I've gotten from other people that were helpful. So I've heard of the temptation, like for early stage investigators in particular, to chase small shiny objects, which are, the pilot study, something like 25 to 75K. And that can be kind of a trap, because those grants are not conducive to seeking independent funding as an independent researcher. So you should have a pilot study for a reason. That one pilot should then have a clear plan to build up to a large scale grant application. And you really want to maintain focus on that as the long-term goal. I've also heard the advice not to over align the aims of your career development award with your first R application. And that's just a timing issue. You know, if you're doing clinical trials research, it takes a long time to collect that data and to publish the paper. And if you wait that long to apply for your first R, then it's, you know, it's a problem with a gap in funding. So ideally, you know, I think you want something that's related, but kind of a spin-off. And that's how it worked out for me, that there was kind of one treatment component with the K23 that I was able to spin off as kind of its own intervention for the R01 application. And so that was advice that I thought was helpful. I've also heard, you know, especially at this stage, that, you know, that the bar is so much higher in terms of what people expect from an R01 application, that you have to give yourself time to really polish it and get established scientists to help you do that. I think it was also important for me to be strategic about pay lines. So I've stuck with NHLBI since the K. I've heard anecdotally that, you know, once you get funding as a career development award from an institute, that they're invested in your success and they'd like to see you continue on. And that's worked for me. It's also, you know, the pay lines differ quite a bit across different institutes. And for NHLBI, it's already on the higher side. And they also offer this advantage to early stage investigators, where you can get a grant funded with 10 percentile points higher than the overall pay line. So that's certainly something to look into as you're thinking about where to target an application. Next slide. And then some resources that have been helpful to me. I'm sure everyone's familiar with NIH Reporter, but they've really, you know, they've beefed it up where you can do a matchmaker tool for study section and for finding program officers. And that's been very helpful to me as I've been kind of thinking strategically about where to target grants. I like Edge for Scholars. It's this website where they've got articles that are great, and kind of periodically they offer these grant writing seminars. They offered this specific AIMS accelerator that I did last year that was really helpful. And I think it also gives you that external accountability if you're doing one of those weekly seminars, that it kind of pushes you to get the work done in time for the next weekly meeting. And I just recently discovered this Faculty Factory podcast that I like a lot too. So if you're a podcast person, that might be one to look into. And that's all I've got. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Amanda. It's great to see like a different approach and different perspectives. What do you think? Would you say that the offerings, the career training offerings and grant writing development resources are similar at Northwestern and at Rush?
I believe so. Yeah, I've done that same R studio that Arshia mentioned through the ITM. And that was kind of similar to what I had done for the K application at Northwestern. There's somebody on the faculty there, Rick McGee, who I think has come to present at other CTSA events, and he's fantastic. He really will take the time to read your aims sentence by sentence and give you just such granular feedback. But, you know, sometimes you get just those kind of blow offy, like, yeah, this looks great, I found a typo kind of responses. So to be able to find people who really engage with your grant, I just learned so much from him as far as grant writing skills. So if you ever see Rick McGee giving a talk here in Chicago, you should go.
There's a question in the chat. Can you say a bit more about how you assess pay lines at different NIH centers?
Yeah, so I can't remember if that's NIH Reporter or a different NIH website, but if you just start Googling institutes and pay lines, so if I Google like NHLBI, I can see their fiscal year 2024 pay lines, and I think not every institute publishes an exact pay line, but for NHLBI, it's 14th percentile for R01s this year. And so I believe there's somewhere that you can actually, you know, kind of get the data and plot those, so you can compare the pay lines by institute for either R's or for K's. So for me in smoking research, I have a few different institutes that I could target, but that was part of the calculus of going towards NHLBI.
Great. Thanks, Amanda. I think we'll move on to Jim now.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. This seems like a wonderful initiative, and it's always exciting to see cross-institutional programs that are successful, because we live in such a rich city, and it's a shame when places remain in silos. So really that's wonderful. So let's see. So I'm a nephrologist. I'm the division chief at the University of Illinois, and I've been here my entire career. My involvement with research really, I began as sort of a clinical educator at the start of my career, and so was very involved in education and training programs, clinical training programs, in taking care of patients. And at that point, it was, became very apparent and obvious that about the problem of chronic kidney disease globally and in the United States, and that our understanding of chronic kidney disease was really and still remains behind what it should be. And so our patient population at UIC, and similar to populations at other institutions in Chicago, being a public institution, large minority population that's disproportionately affected by kidney disease. So that was a pretty obvious, the gaps in knowledge and approaches that we needed to take, were very apparent. And so so I first became involved in some clinical trials, and so sort of as a clinical center PI, involved in trials that just focused on hypertension control, efforts to try to slow the progression of kidney disease. And so that was my first involvement. And then the NIDDK released an initiative to really recognizing that our understanding of the epidemiology of CKD was really behind what it should be. So so we became a clinical center for this study, which was called the Chronic Renal Insufficiency Cohort Study, that really was sort of based on sort of like the typical NHLBI cohort studies, but focused on CKD, sort of like it's considered to be sort of like the Framingham of chronic kidney disease. So this was is a study. It's ongoing. We're entering our final sort of like pay period, but it's a study that's been going on for really 2 decades, and patients with chronic kidney disease were enrolled in the study and followed over time, and really has served to really help look at many different facets of CKD in terms of outcomes and how the lives of patients with CKD is affected by chronic kidney disease. And I see Eleanor is one of our participants today, and she's certainly worked pretty extensively with data from the study, as well as new data collection from the study. But so this study was kind of exciting for us in that it really established an infrastructure for studying the disease, as well as a great sort of launching point for people's careers in terms of offering opportunities to look at different aspects of CKD. And so so as a result of this study and other studies, my career, in addition to sort of like my own research, I began working more and more with early trainees, early career investigators in sort of helping to develop their careers. So that's been a very, important part of my story. And so as part of that, let's see, I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of faculty members within our own institution, other institutions, who had K awards, who are on training grants, had K awards, got their first R. I had a form of a K award called a K24, which is called a mid-career Investigator Award, which I had for 2 periods. You're allowed to have it for 10 years. And I just completed that. And so that protects your time for mentoring. So it sort of like a K Award, provides a small amount of money for research, but it basically protects your time. And so it's a great initiative, and it's something that I don't think enough people are aware of. Let's see. So in terms of preliminary data, thinking about preliminary data, or Amanda made some great points about, applying for a K Award. What kind of preliminary data do you need for a K Award? I've served on a study section for NIDDA's K Awards, particularly in the kidney urology hematology division. And so I was on that study section. And so over time, we've really seen the bar, really has been higher. So a K Award needs to have a lot more than what it had to have like 10 years ago in terms of kind of rigor and the experience of the investigator. That is, I think the other part of the K-Award application is, the importance of not just the research, but that importance of the Career Development Award, and just can't emphasize that enough. A lot of people will say, "Oh, the Career Development." It's hard to say how it's weighted, but it's 2/3. It's 2/3 the importance. It's hard to say, but I think the thing to keep in mind about the career development portion is to really tailor it to not make it a cookie cutter approach. I think we got away with that, like maybe 10, 15 years ago in terms of the types of things that you'd say you do with your career development award. But I think it really needs to be sort of tailored to you and very well integrated into the research plan. So preliminary data required for K Awards, obviously it's challenging because one is at the beginning of their career. So it's hard to, have, robust amount of data, but certainly people who I've worked with have used, data that they, often, the way you format the section varies, but you can sort of format it as, preliminary data and published relevant publications, which I think is a sort of a way to show that, like, yes, I've worked in this area, I've developed these ideas, and ideally to show data that shows that you can implement the project and carry it forth. I've seen people do different types of approaches, and I think it probably depends the type of grant that you are applying for. We've been able to use, for example, data from the CRIC study that would be relevant to the individual's K Award as a nice vehicle. And for example, a faculty member who I worked with, who now actually is now a full professor and has their second R01. Her K Award, it's funny, you have to kind of go back in your memory. But I think she used some data regarding sort of sleep disordered breathing that we looked at, that we observed in CRIC, sort of like sleep quality, and then you kind of use that, even though it wasn't like primary data collection, but it seemed to work well for her. Resources at UIC. I think the resources very similar to the types of resources that have been mentioned, at University of Chicago and at Rush. I think a few things about UIC that are unique in terms of early investigator sort of career resources are, I think the multiple health science colleges, I think, offers an enormous sort of a range of resources. In fact, it's sometimes, even though I've worked here my whole career, we're always surprised at, like, oh my goodness, there's this resources, there's that resource. But, I think with having, College of Medicine, a very large College of Medicine, that's one of the most diverse in the country, School of Public Health, maybe the only school of public health in the state. I'm not sure. I think so. Pharmacy, College of Nursing, dentistry, applied health science. So those are very kind of like terrific resources. We have a CTSA, and I know other institutions have that as well, but which tries to sort of like streamline, to bring together these sort of diverse resources. I think also as a wonderful sort of opportunity, and I'm sure this is present at other institutions, is that the CTSA offers like greatly discounted prices for trainees, particularly trainees on K awards or diversity supplements as well. And so that, like, for example, if you need to do use the Clinical Research Center for patient visits, you know, like like you'll get a discount rate of like 90%, or I mean, it's like really a very useful resource. Let's see. Yeah. Yes, I'm not sure. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Jim. Did you agree with what Amanda said about the timelines for writing for your next grant? Did you think those were reasonable?
And yeah, I think the earlier you start, the more important it is, especially for one's first grants. And I think, Amanda, you said something like at least a 6-month timeline.
Yeah, I know that's not doable in every case, but yeah, that was the advice I got. Kind of over time, you can recycle certain pieces and it goes more quickly, but initially you should give yourself more runway.
Exactly. No, I completely agree. I completely agree. You know, on the other hand, there's always that sort of at least I know I'm a procrastinator, so that's sort of like, you know, no, that's too soon. I'm gonna wait for October. Oh no, that's too soon. I'm gonna wait for June. And I've been the victim of that. So, you know, so keeping yourself accountable and hopefully having a good mentoring team and a good team of collaborators helps to, you know, sort of keep in mind that accountability. But I think that you know, the idea of you know, grant boot camps and having peer review, I think is so important, and I think all of our institutions have that. Another resource that we have, which is kind of neat, and it's institutional, is there's a program called the Chicago KUH Forward, which offers pre and postdoctoral training in neurology and hematologic diseases, and it is really at all 5 academic institutions. The PI is at Northwestern, I'm MPI on it, but we you know, have trainees at, you know, University of Chicago, Northwestern, UIC, Rush, and Loyola, and that's been a really cool program. And Rick does the grant boot camp for that, so yeah.
Oh, Chuka put a question in the comments. Any advice on how to navigate pilot data study results not yet published at the time of submitting your grant?
Yeah, you know, be interested to have others chime in, but you know, it's the preliminary data is kind of like a sales job in a way. You know, it's like a marketing job. So you want to, you know, show yourself well. You're allowed to be a little superficial, but you don't want to, you know, open yourself to criticism. It's challenging because it's like it could be a little bit unfair. I worked with somebody who just submitted their first R01. They have a K23, and they presented some preliminary data that I thought was like, they were doing MRIs in patients with kidney disease, and they were looking for some relationships with pathology findings, and they found, you know, a few sort of like weak associations, you know, that showed it a trend, but the sample size was very very small, and you know, when they discussed it, they said this is a small sample size, but it shows that we can do it, and it also our findings are in the right direction. And yet, you know, someone criticized it and said, oh, there's really no reason to look at this because the preliminary data wasn't impressive. And we're going, so I think that's another thing to keep in mind, is to, maintain a positive attitude. Despite when you get reviewers, when you're doing your revisions, I think to remain positive and not get the kind of attitude that I was just expressing. But, it's always good to vent to friends. But it's challenging. I think it's important to present, and I think it's you acknowledge what limitations are, and that that the findings really reinforce the need for the proposed study. I don't know if others have insights or suggestions.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, Jim and Amanda. Thank you for your presentation. It's been so helpful. Yeah, I think with prelim data, sometimes it's just like proof of concept, like we actually showed in our pilot that we were actually able to get community partners on board and do some church-based education. People came, able to recruit people, we were able to teach peer leaders how to deliver the content. So it was like proof of concept that people will come and, sort of like the feasibility and acceptability, and we measured all of that. So I think just being intentional about any pilot work that you do, are you looking at the feasibility measures, acceptability measures? Because that's really what you can do. You may not be powered to actually assess change in clinical outcomes, but that's what the larger study is for. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, and I think exactly, Arshia. I think showing that you have access to the population of interest, I think that's easy. I mean, that's usually pretty easy to show, and providing some granular numbers. We have a sort of we're a recruitment site for a study that's looking at chronic kidney disease, sort of trying to develop precision medicine approaches. And we just, when in the proposal we showed we have this many patients, we gave all the demographics, and we even did sort of like we approached a certain number of patients and we asked them, would you be willing? We kind of went through the spiel, the intervention. And this intervention was like doing a research kidney biopsy. And so we sort of like did sort of like a mini kind of surveys saying, would you be willing to have a kidney biopsy? And for research purposes, and so we kind of reported on that.
Can I follow up really quick? And thank you so much for your response. It's really, really helpful. I'm right in the middle of writing grants and submitting grants, and I know that some of my preliminary data will not get reviewed. I mean, reviewers are hard to find nowadays, so it takes such a long time. Is there any usefulness to stating everything you said, Jim and Arshia, but also ending with this has been submitted to journal XYZ, and even though they haven't told you anything about acceptance, you're just naming a particular journal? How does that help?
I think that's always a good idea. Like we presented these findings at whatever conference, or had a plenary or an oral or whatever, and currently under review at this journal. Sure, it just shows that, you're able to start a project and like get to the end of it, really, and that you're just waiting for for it to be published. And I think reviewers understand that it can take months and months and months to like, get a paper reviewed, and then a revision, and then acceptance and publication, so and a lot of times I would say some pilot data you can't necessarily publish. If it's like with like 5 patients, maybe you just presented it, but you're not going to maybe necessarily publish that study. So
It's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of chime in, I think the data that or the advice I had seen was to publish only a certain proportion of your pilot data to show that this is still, an active area for you, and kind of to show that promise or potential. That it's okay if it's not completely established and already in press. I might be a little more conservative about naming the specific journal. I mean, maybe you could say it's under review, but I know on CVs, I've seen that criticized, that you wouldn't want to name a journal, because I mean, technically you could submit something to JAMA and it's under review for as long as it takes them to desk reject it. So it's kind of like you wouldn't want to be seen as like name checking a journal before it's, I mean, maybe it would be different if it's like in resubmission, or I don't know. I just don't know if I would name a specific journal as under review, but maybe that's just me.
Yeah, it's funny because I feel like here at U Chicago on RCBs, they actually ask for that. So
Oh,
any
interesting.
institution-
Okay.
Yeah, usually I'm just like, oh, it's under review. They're like, no, you want to state which journal it's under review at.
Oh, okay.
It could be different in a grant. I feel like in a grant application, you can just say that it's probably under review, but you presented it somewhere. I don't think you can go wrong either way, but I don't know.
Ask everyone to comment on how they have used their department infrastructure, maybe mentors or other senior faculty as they go through the process of leveraging their pilot data into grants. Except Amanda, I have a feeling I know how that goes for her.
Well, I have certainly benefited. Yeah. I mean, we do our works in progress meetings, and like you guys have heard from me quite a bit. It's just, I mean, it's nice to have like something on your calendar. So I know if I've got that presentation coming up, it keeps me on track with my writing because I'm just motivated to act like I know what I'm talking about when I'm presenting to colleagues. And yeah, it's nice to get kind of feedback at early stages while you're still fleshing out the idea. So yeah, if you're in a department that's got an infrastructure like that, I think it's a great resource.
Maybe I'll echo that. Like here, U Chicago, we have a diabetes workshop. And pretty much, I think everyone who submits a K or any sort of grant application presents their Ames page at that workshop to get feedback, because oftentimes you wanna get as much feedback as you can. Better to get it from your colleagues, and when you get it in the summary statement from the NIH, so listen, have as many people as you can read over your Ames page, people who are not in your field, who are in your field, and these workshops are great because, especially we have a research workshop too, where it's folks who are doing work in asthma and other, conditions. And you may be writing for a group, of like basic scientists or folks who are doing different things within your condition. So that's always helpful. And I think the other departmental resource that I have used a lot is just when I was first writing my K award, so it did probably take me about 6 months. So I echo Amanda's like start 6 months in advance, mostly because I was actually learning a lot about what I was writing about. Like I didn't know much about diabetes self-management education program, what the literature was out there. Like I had an understanding, but I felt like I had to focus a lot in like reading myself and understanding. I had to put a conceptual model together, which I think is always a helpful exercise. It's good to sort of see where the gaps are and what you're filling. And then to get that feedback from folks. Like at the time that I applied for my K, which was a long time, like 15 years ago, there is actually an interdepartmental group that like actually you had to send in your Ames page, I think like 4 to 5 months before you were going to submit your K. And they chose someone here at the university to like look at your Ames page and give you feedback. So a lot of times the timelines to get feedback are like way earlier than you expect, So starting earlier is always good, because then I had to actually I was like, oh, I need to do qualitative interviews. I've never done that before. Who's that person in my section or in my department? Who is the person who's doing behavioral interventions in Latinx populations? Oh, there was someone in psychiatry. Okay, like bring them on board. So even assembling my mentorship team took me a bit of time, but that was a lot of conversations within my department and with my main mentor, who knew a lot of folks and knew where the gaps were in my skill set and where I needed to sort of fill those gaps. And I think that that mentorship team was actually really important part of the K award application as well, because you're sort of noting like, I'm going to be learning about qualitative research from Dr. Quinn. I'm going to be learning about interventions for Latinx populations with exercise from Dr. Sanchez. And, so those are the two things I would sort of impart also.
I agree. We have very sort of in the Department of Medicine, we have very sort of similar things. We have a grant boot camp each year. We also have an ongoing peer review. And then a few times a year, they have a special session where you can bring in your summary statement just to sort of get input. And So, and I agree totally with Arshia, the importance of the mentoring team. And in fact, sometimes there's so many opportunities that you have to be very judicious. There's so many like training opportunities and career development types of things that you can go to, but you need to be kind of judicious about what's worthwhile for you and what will be useful. So, I mean, it's great to have more than to have so many opportunities available.
See, there's a question also by Eleanor about what if it's a short turnaround?
Yeah, I would be curious to hear others' thoughts on this, but I've actually explicitly gotten the advice that ESI should not go for call for applications like that, that the short turnaround time is a huge disadvantage, and it ends up benefiting, very established research teams who can, assembly line style, just, rehash kind of pieces of existing grants. And if you're an ESI, those those grant applications, unless it's just right on the money, exactly what you want to do, that you're kind of at a disadvantage there.
Yeah, I agree. I think the only time I've done a short turnaround for a grant is when I actually had something already that I just needed to tweak and resubmit.
I agree.
Okay, last call for questions. Anybody? I love this topic that came up towards the end about mentorship teams, and Arshia talking about creating a mentorship team. I think that's a ripe discussion for a future seminar down the road, and when's the best time to do that, and how do you do it, and how do you approach people? Anyway, oh, is there anything in the chat? Okay. Yeah, that's a good observation, Eleanor. Okay, well, it seems like we're all done. And thank you guys for participating, Amanda, Arshia, and Jim. And thank you guys for your attendance, everyone else. And I will put together this recording and get it posted on YouTube. It'll be a private link like that you can share, but it's not going to be posted publicly. And I'll send out Amanda's slides as well. And yeah, so I hope you guys enjoyed it.
Great.
Thanks, Melanie.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.